Hello everyone, I'm Nick with Nick Reads Fantasy, and today we're going over my top 10 books of 2024. And I know the filming location's a little bit different than typical, but I've been having trouble finding time to make this video. And then I look on my GPS today and it says traffic's an hour longer than it typically is in order to get home. So I figured I could either make excuses or I can make the video. So here I am putting the list together, and we're going over my top 10 reads of 2024. These will be pretty quick blurbs because most of these books have either already gotten their own full review or will be getting their own review later next year. So without further delay, coming in at the number 10 spot of 2024 is Fires of Heaven, which is book 5 of the Wheel of Time. And honestly, my time with the Wheel of Time can kind of be summarized as consistently better than average, with only Rising Shadow really blowing me away. But this book actually came pretty dang close, and I'd probably say is my second favorite book in the series thus far. I feel like the last two books have really been our main characters making decisions for themselves, of them becoming the heroes the world needs, instead of them kind of being at the mercy of others people's decisions and plans. Like the first 3 books seem to be other people kind of deciding their fate, whereas these last 2, they've been making their own choices. They are becoming their own people. So I had a great time with this book. It's number 10 on my list, and I'm honestly bummed I didn't read any more of these books. That I didn't make them a priority this past year. So I'm definitely going to read more of the Wheel of Time in this upcoming year. And Fires of Heaven comes down in the number 10 spot on this list. Up next is my 9th favorite book of the year. And it's a book I actually heard from my brother, which is really surprising considering he doesn't read very often. But he hit me up and was like, hey, you have to, he knows I like fantasy, of course. And he says, hey, you have to try this Dragon Rider fantasy I've read. You have to read it. And of course I thought, there's no way he's actually going to recommend me Aragon. Like, I love Aragon, but I read this years and years and years ago. Like, where's he been? And then my mind went elsewhere. I'm like, what Dragon Rider books have come out recently? And I thought, like, is he really going to recommend me Fourth Wing? Which I don't think I've discussed here much on this channel, but I have super strong opinions about modern romantasy. So I was going to be flabbergasted if he recommended me Fourth Wings, but to my surprise, he recommended neither. Instead, he recommended the book that will come in as the 9th best book of 2024. And that book is Ascendant by Michael R. Miller. And this is a self-published book that was truly incredible. It was an incredible piece of fantasy that made me feel like a kid again. It made me feel like I picked up Aragon and was having that type of experience. And it starts with a dragon egg that has a defect in it. The defect is a physical sign to the dragons and the riders that this hatchling will be born with disabilities, that this hatchling will be born with weaknesses. And this is important because they don't let these eggs hatch. They don't let them survive. They destroy them. But as our main character carries this egg to its destruction, he feels how wrong it is to kill this being for its differences, even if those differences are a disability. And because of this, our main character, our main dragon character, is blind. And not blind in the way that actually ends up being a strength like a lot of fantasy does, or at least in the first book. No, this dragon is blind in like a truly disabling way that makes it so that he finds himself dependent on the boy who eventually becomes his rider. The big thing I want to point out with this book is that there is nothing new in this book. It is a classic Dragon Rider fantasy full of old tropes and familiar stories. There's even a note from the author at the end of the book that mentions all these tropes. He essentially says that this was his goal. He wanted to write an amazing story with as many fantasy tropes as possible. And I love this. No, I needed this. I have actually gotten a ton of flack for my Empire of Silence video, where I mentioned that Empire of Silence is a less than average book. It is not as good as the average fantasy book or the average science fantasy book. And I stand by that review. But the main criticism thrown my way is that I mentioned the tropes and quotes that Rockio uses, and that it made it hard for me to appreciate his story for what it is. and instead only made me think about the great works that inspired him in the first place. But my issue was never Rockio using tropes. It's the fact that his execution of those tropes and callbacks wasn't done in a skillful enough way to let me appreciate the story he was trying to tell. In other words, I just don't think Rockio, at the time of writing Empire of Silence, had the skills necessary to accomplish what he was trying to do. And Ascendant, on the other hand, is the perfect example of old recycled tropes done right. It shows that, like, I don't mind tropes. I don't mind rewritings of other stories. I just want it done skillfully. And from the very beginning of this book, we are bombarded with tropes that would make this story in other hands feel unoriginal. But Ascendant was a fresh take on these old stories that had me sitting on the edge of my seat the entire time. And it made me remember why I like classic fantasy tropes so much. But honestly, that's enough about Ascendant. I need to leave something for the full review. So I'm going to keep moving on with my list. And now we're at the number 8 spot, which is a book that will probably surprise many fans of the channel, especially because of my reaction to the first book. People were not happy with this review, to say the least. And I was really hoping to originally make my video about me rereading this book and then my full review of book 2 before this top 10 list came out. But I just haven't had the time. So I'm just going to rip off the Band-Aid and tell everyone my 8th favorite book of 2024 was Howling Dark, book 2 of the Sun Eater series by Christopher Rockio. And I know, I just talked all that trash about Empire Silence being a worse than average book. And I'm not going to say much more here because, like I said, I'm going to devote 2 full videos to my reread of Empire Silence and then my first read through of Howling Dark. But essentially, the summary is, I stand by my review of Empire of Silence. I do believe that it is a worse than average book and gets around 2 stars. But y'all were right about the fact that Howling Dark is amazing. Howling Dark is everything that I was promised with the first book. It's an epic space opera that is having a conversation with the books that inspired Rockio in the first place. This is Rockio having those conversations, writing his own story, instead of living in his predecessor's shadows. It honestly kind of it flusters me, because if it wasn't for the respect I have for Rockio, the interviews I've seen him talking about his love of fantasy and science fiction here on book 2, I probably would not have continued with the story. It's just too long of a series, and the books are too long to devote that much time to something I didn't enjoy as much as the average read. And if people continue to be correct and book 3 is even better than book 2, then I will be super happy I stuck it out. So make sure you like and subscribe to see if you're enjoying the video so that you can see those 2 videos next year. Also, I've been reviewing a lot less popular books recently, books that don't get as much attention, so aren't going to be in the algorithm as much. So liking and subscribing or even commenting will help this small channel grow. But moving on, we're at number 7 now, and we get to a book that I really just read on a whim. One that I wasn't very excited about, one that I had only seen 1 or 2 reviews about, and I didn't really know anything about it. But I ended up picking it up because, 1, it's a Tour Essential, and you'll see later on in this video that I've been having great luck with the Tour Essentials. And then 2, it's because I was out of Audible credits, and this book was free, and that is Blindsight by Peter Watts. And this book, what little I knew about it did not sound good to me. It sounded terrible. I heard it described as vampires in space, but it was supposedly also hard sci-fi. And if I was trying to sell a book, this is how I would not do it. I would not describe it this way. But I'm so glad I picked it up, because while that description is not wrong, it ended up being a solid piece of science fiction, and I'm really glad I read it. I mean, it made it into my top 7 books of 2024. And as a quick summary, the book is actually 3 stories in 1 novel. The first is a dystopian future sci-fi novels where human and technology begin to merge, and this merging has dire consequences on how humans live. The second story in this book is a first contact novel where these dystopian beings have to navigate finding out that they're not the only ones in the universe. And then I think the third and probably part of the aspect I had the most fun with was that this book is a horror novel. And the horror comes from watching these different elements dance together on the page. And these three stories don't sound like they would come together, but somehow Peter Watts is able to write them together, create what is arguably hard science fiction, if somewhat implausible hard science fiction, and create a truly incredible story. The next book on this list, I don't even have to stop myself from saying I'm going to do a full review about it because it's already done. I already did the review on this book. Coming in at number 6 is yet another Tor essential. It's going to be the second one on this list so far. And that book is The Black Company by Glenn Cook. And you can honestly just go watch my review of this for the full breakdown. But my 10-second breakdown is that my experience with this book was very difficult getting started. It was hard for me to get immersed in this because Cook's writing style is so abrasive. It's so non-traditional. But once I did get into this and I did embrace his writing style, I loved it. Like, this book is the gold standard of grimdark fantasy, and it follows a group of mercenaries as they sign a contract, putting themselves at the mercy of this group of powerful beings with power beyond their understanding. It's a grimdark world, a grimdark story, devoid of hope and goodness, with the end result being a book that I couldn't put down. I cannot say enough good things about this book, so go check out my full review if you're interested in this story. But moving on to number 5, we get another book that I read on a whim, but unlike Blindsight, who I had never heard of the author before, I was super familiar with this author, so I had a lot of faith in it. And I knew it would be good, even if I didn't think it would make it into the top 5. But surprise, surprise, it did. And coming in at number 5, we get ABorrowed Man by Gene Wolfe. And the best way to describe this book is a dystopian science fiction, where the dystopian science fiction storyline is actually taking place in the background. It's taking place in between the words of the main storyline. At the forefront of this book, ABorrowed Man is a noir detective novel in which the clones of dead people are stored in libraries and be checked out like books with library cards. And that's exactly what happens here. A clone of a long-dead famous mystery writer is recruited to help solve a murder that only he can solve. This book is just dripping with that black and white noir style mystery, while also somehow giving off that like cyberpunk futuristic type feel. It was not what I was used to. It's not my typical cup of tea when I choose to pick out a story. But Gene Wolfe is, and he absolutely blew me away. But the big part about this book that I want to stress is that this book made it this high on my list, having only been the first novel in what is a duology. And normally that wouldn't be a big deal, except for the fact that my experience with Gene Wolfe books is that their full potential is not realized until the entire series is finished. Because you get so much more information about the first book and the second book. That's just how he writes. So the fact that this book is this high on my list gives me a book that like I might enjoy it even more after reading the sequel, which is Interlibrary Loan. And with that book out of the way, we get into my top 4 books of the year. And I think this is really where the quality of the books jump. It's not just that these next 4 books are my top 4 of 2024. These are some of my favorite books. These books have made it to be some of my favorite books of all time that I've ever read, period. So without further ado, I'm going to mention my number 4 book, which is A Canticle Al Libowitz by Walter M. Miller Jr. And just to get y'all paying attention to me about this book, I'm going to start with 3 cool fun facts that might grab your attention. Number 1, this book inspired parts of the popular Fallout video game, and it's readily apparent from its start. 2, if you're a fan of magical libraries, this book has one of the coolest versions I've ever seen, designed to preserve human knowledge. And the third thing I want to mention about this, the third cool fun fact, is that this book is so incredible that it's never been out of print since it was first published in 1959. So now that I have your attention, A Canticle Al Libowitz is a post-apocalyptic science fiction that is broken down into 3 parts. And it follows humanity as it fights for its survival after the feared nuclear apocalypse of the Cold War becomes a reality. The first book, Fiat Homo, starts with a story of a monk helping canonize the patron of his abbey, Saint Libowitz, all while performing the abbey's main mission of the world, which is to seek out knowledge of the past and store it for safekeeping. Part 2 follows the same abbey hundreds of years in the future as people start becoming more familiar with science, when people start seeking out knowledge and luckily discovering that the church has devoted the past several hundred years to this very cause. Now that they're beginning to discover the processes of science, they are beginning to find the value of the books that they have spent the past 100 years preserving. And lastly, part 3 follows these people as they enter the space age. They're to the point technologically where they can travel between planets. So they're past the point where we are now. And we watch how they try to navigate using this technology and building these different societies while they come to the brink of war again, like they come to arms again. They're in another type of Cold War. And if this sounds boring, you would be incredibly wrong. Terribly wrong. Because yes, it does sound boring, but never has anyone taken such an accurate description of what happens in libraries and makes it a page turner like you find here. And don't get me wrong, if I heard somebody describe the plot of this book, I too would think, that sounds boring. That sounds terrible. And I would have been wrong. Canticle Al Libowitz was a mind-blowing book that started out as an entertaining romp and ended with me like contemplating the meaning of life. Like, I can't recommend this book highly enough, and it's one of the books I am most excited to review next year. And I'm dying for that special edition version that Mike from Mike's Books Reviews got. Like, holy cow, that is beautiful, and I want it. I will never afford it, but I want it. But moving on, and I know I'm talking a lot about books that are going to get their own review. I'm just excited. This was a good reading year for me. But moving on to number 3 is a reread of a classic we all love, and everything's already been said about it. So I'm just going to throw 3 new little tidbits out there. And that book is The Fellowship of the Ring by J.R.R. Tolkien. And I'm not going to say anything besides the fact that, number 1, you need to go listen to the Andy Serkis edition. It's one of the most incredible things you'll ever experience. He is literally such a good voice actor that he recreated the voices of the characters in the movies so perfectly. There were times I forgot that it wasn't Gandalf actually speaking. It was Andy Serkis. The second thing I want to mention is that I forget, because the second movie is, in my opinion, the best out of the movies, I forget that as far as the books go, Fellowship and Return of the King, they rule the trilogy. And since I didn't get to my reread of Return of the King, I'm just going to say, Fellowship of the Ring's the best out of the 3. And that's why it made it onto my top 3 books. It is that good. I just had to throw it back on there. It continues to impress me with every reread, and for sure is one of my favorite books of all time. All right, and now we get into the top 2. And coming in at number 2 is a book that fans of the series, people who love this series and consider it to be the greatest series of all time, they are torn on this book. Some people don't like this book because their opinion is this book reveals too much. It takes away some of the mystery. Others just don't care for how different everything is in this book from the first 4 original books. As for myself, I agree that this book being so different than the others was a shock. It was a big shock. It took me time to really get into this book. But I also think it was an incredible addition to the series that explained just enough to help me understand the story I read, while also creating entirely new mysteries for me to ponder and explore. So coming in at the number 2 spot is Earth of the New Sun, which is book 5 of Book of the New Sun by Gene Wolfe. And the book starts very differently than what we're used to. Severian is in space, far from Earth, and he's about to jettison his rewriting of his memoir into the depths of emptiness. And while he's doing this, Gene Wolfe is describing the most beautiful scenery we have ever seen. It's a spaceship made of wood with sails and masts. And while he's describing this monstrosity that is nothing like the ships we have seen at sea, Severian is navigating a spacewalk to start his mission. And the only other thing I'm going to say about this is that Gene Wolfe is the only author on this list more than once for a reason. And a good reason. It's the fact that everything this man writes is far better than average, with most of the books I've read being amongst my favorite of all times. And with Earth of the New Sun out of the way, there's only one left. And if you're a fan of the channel, you know what it is. It is once again written by Gene Wolfe, and it is The Wizard Knight, which is actually a duology. It's a combination of The Knight, which is book 1, and The Wizard, which is book 2. And The Knight is a portal fantasy where a teenage boy is transported to a magical realm where he's transfigured, or at least physically, into a knight of legend. And he then goes on a quest for a sword promised to him, all while learning what it truly means to be a knight. The Wizard, which is book 2 of the duology, or the second half of The Wizard Knight, continues the story where the knight left off. But I would almost argue that this is where the story truly begins. The knight, Sir Abel of the High Heart, now recognized as the honorable knight he had set out to become, navigates quests and challenges before him while he's trying to find and live with his beloved Disrays. But things aren't so simple. He has vows to more than one master, and his king and his people need his help to restore order and balance to the 7 worlds, even if they aren't aware that they need his help at all. And I already have a full review of The Wizard Knight out, so I'm not going to say anything more about this, except for that this book hit me so hard when I finished it that afterwards I just sat there stewing for hours and hours and hours. Maybe it wasn't hours and hours and hours I was sitting there. Maybe I'm exaggerating. But the point is, I sat there and stewed just in my thoughts and emotions. And when I finally did decide to move on and pick up another book, I just restarted Wizard Knight all over again. So with that book out of the way, my top 10 list comes to an end. Hope you enjoyed. And don't forget to like and subscribe to get notified when the next videos come out. Like I said, we're a small channel and we are reviewing a lot of less known, unpopular books. So any interaction with the videos help the channel grow. And until next time, read more books and I'll see you soon. Thanks for watching.